Well, hey there, everybody. It's your boy, Mr. Perry, and here we are getting into Unit 2, Lesson 8. And today we're going to talk about what are called wrapper classes. And in particular, we're going to be looking at the integer and the double class. So before we proceed, now is a good time to make sure that you guys are all aware of the Java Quick Reference Guide. So you actually will have a cheat sheet of sorts when you take your AP exam. And this will be included in your test. And basically what it is a reference sheet where you can look up a bunch of different methods and what they do. So for instance, we recently learned the string class methods. So the length, substring, index of, equals, and compare to. So all of those methods are going to be listed here for you. So if you forget what they do or how they operate, you'll be able to reference this. And you'll also notice that it has something called the integer class, which includes integer int value, which is a constructor, integer.min value, integer.max value. You probably recognize those from previous lecture videos, and then something called int value. There's also something called the double class, which, again, there's a constructor for a double, and then there is a method called double value. So this is interesting. This is kind of new. Of course, we've been talking about integers and doubles in this class as primitive data types. So it's weird that they have their own class. Let's go ahead and dive into this and see what this is all about. So this lesson is all about what's called the wrapper class or wrapper classes. And it turns out that even though we have primitive data types, every primitive data type actually has built into Java what's called a wrapper class. It's part of the java.lang package, which is built in, so we don't have to import anything. We just automatically have access to these. And they've got a couple of different versions of it. So since we know we have classes that correspond with primitive data types, well, that means there has to be an integer class. And down here you can see integer I equals new integer 2. This on the older version of Java, this creates an integer object with the value of 2. And then you see here double D equals new double 3.5. On the older versions of Java, this creates a double object. In the newer versions of Java, you can just do it like this. You can just say integer I equals 2, and that calls the constructor for the integer wrapper class. And then the same thing down here, double D equals 3.5. This is just the shorter, newer way of doing it. So what even is a wrapper class? So I like to always explain it to my students as it's kind of like taking a primitive data type, a primitive value, and wrapping it in a fancy box. So, whereas before, when we were referring to ints, doubles, and booleans, we always did them as all lowercase. And, we understood that these are values that are being stored in specific amounts of memory space. Each of these has, fixed amounts of bytes reserved to them. And if we take these primitive data types and if we kind of wrap them in a fancy box, and now we refer to them, with capital letters, integer, double, boolean, it's like a little bit more fancy and formal, I guess. That's one way to think about the wrapper class. What the wrapper class basically is a special class that's dedicated to represent different primitive data types. And it basically allows us to take advantage of a couple of special methods, a couple of useful methods that we can use for a variety of purposes. So how to access the wrapper class? Well, basically all you do is you just create an object of the integer or double class. And once you create those objects, you can now use that object name to call different methods. So if I, instead of saying my int equals 9, which would basically just only allow me to use that value of 9, if I instead say integer my int equals new integer and pass in 9, now I have an integer object which would allow me to use methods of the integer class. And the same thing is true down here. If I said double my double equals new double 99.99, I now have a double object called myDouble that I can use to call some methods. So you might be asking yourself, why? Why does this exist? Wrapper classes are useful for storing primitive data types in what are called array lists, which we're going to learn about those later on in the class. So before we can use the array list class, we need to be aware of wrapper classes because those are an important component of that. But like I said, wrapper classes also have methods that are built in that can provide useful information. So one of the attributes that is built into the integer class is min value and max value. And we've already learned about what's called overflow and underflow. We know that if we go to the integer min value and subtract 1, that we're going to get kind of a weird error message where suddenly it's going to go positive. And the same is true with integer.max value. If we try to add 1, we've created an overflow error, and we know that it's going to, respond by pushing you into the negative category. So, just a quick review here: integer min value and integer max value refer to these special values on either end of this number line. And if we set a variable and if we declare a variable and assign it the value of integer max value, that means we're way over here, and if we try to add 1 to it, we know it's going to bump us way over here, and we're going to get negative values. So that would be the thing that basically lets you know something has gone wrong. So just be aware of statements like this. If you take min value and subtract 1, that's going to cause integer underflow error. Or statements like this where you say integer.max value, and if you add 1, that's going to cause the integer overflow error, which again is indicated by a negative number. So let's look at the integer class. Here's an integer class UML. And so its attributes, we have your min and your max value, but it also has some behaviors down here. It's got some methods we can use. There's int value that we can call, and then there's something called parse int with a string that we can call. So let's have a look at what these are. So if you create an integer object, integer num equals 23. And let's say you wanted to get the primitive data type value from that. What you can do is you can take your integer object num, and you can call the int value method. And what it's going to do is it's going to return the value of whatever this is as a primitive data type, as an int. So if you had an integer object, but if you wanted to store it as a primitive data type, this is one way that you would do that. Now parse int is basically how you convert a string that contains integers into an actual primitive data type. So if you wanted to get the integer value rather than treating it as a string, then you could do it like this. So let's say you had a string object called num and it was set to 23. What you could do is, if you wanted to convert this to a normal int, you would say int x equals, and then you would call integer.parseInt with num as your parameter or as your argument. And again, that's going to convert the string to an int, and it's going to save it as an int. So really, both of these methods, int value and parseInt, they both convert a value into a normal int, the primitive data type. This one up here converts the integer object into a normal primitive data type. This one down here, parseInt, converts a string version of an integer into the normal primitive data type. And remember that static methods get called by the name of the class, not the object. So up here, let's just back up really quick. Int value is a normal method, so that gets called with a object, right? So down here, we create an integer object called num, and we call it with the integer object num. Whereas Parse int is a static method. It says static int parse int. And remember, those get called with the name of the class, integer.parseInt. So there's, again, some strange, level of detail that you have to pay attention to with these, and just remembering the difference between a non-static object method versus a static or class method. Now, something very similar happens with the double class. We have two attributes of the double class, negative infinity and positive infinity. As far as I know, we don't really use those very much in this class, but down here we do have, again, two methods. There is the double value method, and then there's the static double parse double method. So this first one, double value, is going to return a double as a primitive data type. So the first thing you need to do is have an object of the wrapper class, double num equals 23.5. And then down here, if I call num.doubleValue, that's going to return the value 23.5 as the primitive data type of a double. So it could then be stored as a variable, and it could be used for whatever it needs to do. And then similarly, down here, string num equals 23.5, but again, that's being stored as a string literal. So if I wanted to convert this string into a double, I would say double x equals, and then again, using the static method, double.parseDouble, passing in num as my argument here, it would convert that string into a normal double, and then I could store that as a double variable. Again, string methods get called by the name of the class, not the object. And then we're going to go ahead and finish things with a couple of other concepts that are really more related to terminology than anything else. But also it's important to know that this will actually compile okay. So Java does this thing called auto-boxing. Java automatically converts a primitive value into its wrapper class. So up here, I'm creating an int, a variable of the int type. So this is your primitive data type, int x equals 64. So x is a primitive data type, storing the value of 64. So I could just print 64 and it would print out okay. But then check it out. Down here it says integer y is equal to x. So what this is going to do is this is going to take our primitive data type of 64, and it's going to automatically convert it into a integer object called y, and that is called auto-boxing. It's taking a primitive data type and putting it inside that fancy box of the integer class. And so down here, I could print y.intValue. I would have to call the intValue method in order to get it to print. But there you go. So this is an example of what auto-boxing looks like. And again, it's just anytime you take a primitive data type and automatically store it as its corresponding wrapper class. And then you can, just like you can auto-box, you can also unbox. Java will automatically convert an object of a wrapper class to its corresponding primitive data type. So down here, integer x equals new integer 64. So x is an object of the wrapper class. But then down here, converted int equals x. So what this is going to do is this is going to take your integer object x, which is storing the value of 64, and it's going to unbox it. It's going to store it as the primitive data type 64. And there you go. And you don't even have to call the int value. You could call the int value method here if you wanted to, but it turns out you don't even have to do that. And similarly down here, double y equals new double 2.99. Down here I can just say double converted double equals y, and it will automatically unbox the wrapper class double and convert it into a primitive data type. And again, notice that this is happening even without saying y.doubleValue. You don't have to call that method, but either of them will work, and it's important to be aware of the fact that both will work. All right, guys, well, it's time for our lesson review. The integer class and double class are wrapper classes that create objects from primitive data types. You want to be familiar with the integer and double class methods and constructors, including what they do and when they are used. and you want to be able to find them on the Java Quick Reference Guide so that you don't get confused during your exam. Autoboxing is the automatic conversion that the Java compiler makes between primitive data types and their corresponding object wrapper classes. So this includes converting an int to an integer and a double to a double. And then similarly, unboxing is the automatic conversion that the Java compiler makes from the wrapper class to the corresponding primitive data type. So this includes converting an integer to an int and a double to a double. All right, guys, thanks for watching. I will see you in class.